He slammed the petite Maid against the steel wall of the utility room, his laughter echoing off the industrial pipes, absolutely certain his rank as head of security made her his property. The kitchen staff in the hallway froze, terrified, knowing better than to intervene. But then the laughter stopped, not with a shout or a warning. It stopped because the temperature in that back room plummeted 10 degrees, because imported Italian cologne cut through the stench of fear, and because Carmine Rizzo's shadow fell across the doorway like a death sentence. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's go back to hours before, where it all started. What the boss did next wasn't a rescue. It was an execution of protocol. A brutal reminder carved into flesh and bone that in the Rizzo estate, there was only one law, one judge, and one executioner. And every person in that room, from the cowering witnesses to the man now bleeding on the concrete floor, understood exactly what it meant when Carmine Rizzo said the words that would echo through the entire organization. You don't touch what's mine. If you're ready to dive into this dark romantic thriller, go ahead and subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Tomorrow, I've got another intense story coming your way. And trust me, you don't want to miss it. All right, back to the story. The Rizzo family estate smelled like money and fear in equal measure. Polished Carrara marble stretched down hallways wide enough to drive a car through. Crystal chandeliers worth more than most people's homes cast warm golden light over cold white stone. But if you walk through the service entrance, down the narrow back stairs where the help moved like ghosts, the smell changed. Industrial cleaner, anxiety, the metallic tang of old violence that had soaked into the walls and never quite left. Morgana Piazza had learned to navigate these back corridors with the precision of someone whose survival depended on it. At 25, she perfected the art of making herself invisible, moving through the staff tunnels like smoke, there and gone before anyone could truly register her presence. Her dark wavy hair was always pinned back in a severe bun, tight enough to give her tension headaches by midday. Her black and white Maid uniform was pressed so crisp the edges could draw blood. Everything about her appearance screamed one message: I'm not worth noticing. But the problem with trying to be invisible in a place like the Rizzo estate was that invisibility only worked if the predators let it work. And Morgana had begun to realize, with a growing sense of dread that settled like ice water in her stomach, that her carefully constructed camouflage was failing. It was her 5th day on the estate, and she could feel eyes on her constantly. Not the casual glances of coworkers or the dismissive looks of the upper staff. These were different, calculating, predatory, the kind of attention that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up and her hands shake when she thought no one was looking. She'd first noticed it on day 2. She'd been carrying a stack of fresh linens through the main service corridor when she'd felt it, that prickling sensation of being watched. She turned her head just slightly, careful not to make it obvious, and caught a glimpse of him. Danilo Davide, head of estate security, leaning against the wall near the staff break room. 6 feet and 1 inch of muscle and casual menace, his pale skin stark against the dark gray of his security uniform. His cold blue eyes had been locked on her, tracking her movement with the focus of a hunter sizing up prey. She'd looked away immediately, kept walking, forced her breathing to stay steady. Don't react. Don't acknowledge. Don't give him anything to work with. But he'd been there again on day 3. And day 4. Always in her peripheral vision. Always watching. Those pale blue eyes following her through the corridors like spotlights she couldn't escape. Now, on day 5, Morgana moved through the staff tunnels with her shoulders slightly hunched, her gaze fixed firmly on the gray concrete floor. The tunnels were a maze beneath the main estate, narrow passages lit by bare bulbs that flickered and hummed. Pipes ran along the ceiling, some of them wrapped in insulation that had seen better days, others exposed and sweating condensation that made the air feel damp and close. She was pushing a utility cart loaded with cleaning supplies, the wheels squeaking slightly as she navigated a turn. The sound echoed off the concrete walls, announcing her presence to anyone who might be listening. She hated that squeak. It made her feel exposed, like a mouse making noise in a house full of cats. Her mind wasn't on the cleaning supplies or the squeaking wheel, though. It was 300 miles away, in a small apartment in a city she'd left behind 6 months ago. An apartment where her 15-year-old sister Sophia was staying with their elderly aunt, counting down the days until Morgana could get her out. Sophia's face floated in Morgana's mind, all dark eyes and nervous smile. The same features Morgana saw in the mirror, but younger, more vulnerable. Sophia had her whole life ahead of her. She was smart, so smart, top of her class in math and science. She deserved college. She deserved safety. She deserved a life that didn't involve looking over her shoulder every 5 seconds or learning which streets to avoid after dark. And Morgana was going to give her that life. It was the only thing that mattered. The only reason she was here, in this marble prison, surrounded by men who looked at her like she was something they could take. The plan was simple. Work for 6 months, maybe 8. Save every penny she could. The Rizzo estate paid cash to household staff who didn't ask questions, and they paid well. No taxes, no paper trail, just bills folded into an envelope every Friday. If she was careful, if she kept her head down and didn't make waves, she could save enough to buy Sophia a new identity. A passport that said she was 18, not 15. A plane ticket to somewhere far away, maybe Canada or England, somewhere with decent schools and no connection to the life they'd known. Somewhere safe. 8 months. That was all she needed. 8 months of invisibility. The cart will hit a crack in the concrete and jolted, bringing Morgana back to the present. She steadied the supplies, glancing up reflexively to check her surroundings, and that was when she saw him. Danilo was at the far end of the corridor, near the industrial kitchen entrance. He wasn't alone. 3 other security staff members stood with him, all of them in the same dark gray uniforms, all of them with the same predatory ease that came from knowing you were the enforcement arm of a criminal empire. They were laughing about something, passing around a silver flask that caught the light from the overhead bulb. Morgana's breath caught in her throat. She could turn around. She could take the long way through the east tunnel, add 10 minutes to her route. She should turn around. But the laundry supervisor, Mrs. Chun, had been explicit. The guest suites on the 3rd floor needed servicing before 6 p.m. It was already 5:15. If Morgana took the long route, she'd be late, and being late meant drawing attention, meant questions, meant becoming visible in all the wrong ways. She forced her feet to keep moving, pushing the cart forward, eyes down. Maybe they wouldn't notice her. Maybe they'd be too absorbed in whatever they were drinking and laughing about to pay attention to one small Maid with a cart full of cleaning supplies. She was 15 feet away when Danilo's voice cut through the corridor like a blade. Well, well, the little mouse finally comes out to play. Morgana's hands tightened on the cart handle, but she didn't stop, didn't look up, just kept walking, kept breathing. Ignore it. He's testing you. Don't react. Hey, Danilo's voice was sharper now, edged with something that made her stomach clench. I'm talking to you. She had no choice. She stopped the cart, looked up, forced her face into an expression of polite neutrality. Yes, Mr. Davide. He was looking at her the way a cat looks at a bird with a broken wing. His pale blue eyes traveled slowly from her face down to her feet and back up again, lingering in places that made her skin crawl. The other security staff had stopped talking, all of them watching now, their expressions ranging from amused to hungry. You've been here almost a week, Danilo said, his words slightly slurred. The flask in his hand caught the light again as he gestured with it. Haven't heard you say more than 2 words. You mute or something? No, sir. Just focused on my work. Focused on your work, he repeated, his tone mocking. One of the other security guys snickered. That's cute. Real professional. Morgana felt her pulse hammering in her throat, but kept her voice steady. Is there something you need, Mr. Davide? Mrs. Chun is expecting these supplies upstairs. Mrs. Chun can wait. Danilo took a step toward her, and Morgana's entire body went rigid. I've been meaning to have a conversation with you. About respect. About how things work around here. The security staff behind him were grinning now, sensing blood in the water. One of them, a heavy-set man with a thick neck and dead eyes, was actually rubbing his hands together like he was warming them up for a show. "I understand the hierarchy, Mr. Davide," Morgana said carefully. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to run, but her feet felt welded to the concrete floor. "I respect everyone's position here." "Do you?" Danilo closed another step, near enough now that she could smell the whiskey on his breath mixed with cigarette smoke and the sour tang of sweat. "Because from where I'm standing, you've been avoiding me, ducking into rooms when you see me coming, taking the long routes through the tunnels. That doesn't seem very respectful." Morgana's mind raced. She hadn't thought he'd noticed. She'd been so careful, so subtle, but apparently not careful enough. "I apologize if I gave that impression. I'm just trying to stay out of everyone's way while I learn the routines." "Stay out of everyone's way," Danilo repeated slowly, his eyes narrowing. "See, that's the problem right there, Mouse. You're thinking about this all wrong." He reached out, and Morgana flinched before she could stop herself. His hand froze in midair, and his expression shifted from amused to something darker. Behind him, the other security staff went quiet. "You scared of me?" Danilo asked, his voice dropping to something that was almost gentle, which somehow made it more terrifying. "No, sir." "Liar." He said it softly, but the word landed like a slap. "You're shaking." She was. Morgana could feel the tremor in her hands, see it in the way her knuckles had gone white against the cart handle. She tried to force her muscles to relax, but her body wasn't listening to her brain anymore. It was pure survival mode, every nerve ending lit up and screaming danger. "I just need to get these supplies upstairs," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "Please." The please was a mistake. She saw it register in Danilo's eyes, saw the flash of triumph there. He'd found her weakness. He knew she was afraid, and he knew she was too afraid to do anything about it. "Tell you what," Danilo said, his tone shifting to something that probably would have sounded reasonable to anyone who wasn't paying attention. "You finish your shift, then you come find me in the security office. We'll have that conversation about respect. Private. Just you and me." Every cell in Morgana's body was screaming no. She knew what that meant. She'd seen enough, lived through enough, to understand exactly what Danilo was offering. A private conversation that would end with her dignity in shreds and her job, depending on her silence. "I don't think that would be appropriate, Mr. Davide." The temperature in the corridor dropped 10 degrees. Danilo's face hardened, the mask of reasonableness sliding away to reveal something cold and cruel underneath. "You don't think it would be appropriate," he repeated slowly. "Who the hell do you think you are, Mouse? You think you get to tell me no?" The other security staff shifted, moving slightly closer, forming a loose semicircle that cut off any easy escape route. Morgana's throat felt like it was closing up, her lungs struggling to pull in air. "I'm sorry," she managed, the words scraping out. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I just meant that I need to focus on my job and my responsibilities here. That's all I'm here for." "Your responsibilities," Danilo said, his voice venomous now, "include doing what you're told when someone above you tells you to do it. And I'm telling you, security office, 9 p.m. You got that?" Morgana's mind was spinning, searching desperately for a way out that wouldn't make this worse. She could agree. She could lie, say yes, and then just not show up. But what would happen tomorrow? And the day after? How long could she avoid him in a place where there was nowhere to hide? She thought of Sophia, of the envelope of cash already hidden in her mattress, of the 8 months stretching ahead of her like an eternity. If she lost this job, if she had to start over somewhere else, it would set everything back. But if she went to that security office tonight, something told her she wouldn't walk out the same person she walked in as. "Mr. Davide," she started, but she didn't get to finish. The overhead lights flickered just for a second, and in that brief moment of dimness, Morgana saw Danilo's hand move. He reached for her, fingers outstretched, and her body moved on pure instinct. She jerked backward, stumbling, her hip hitting the cart and sending it rolling several feet down the corridor with a metallic shriek that echoed off the walls. The sound seemed to break something in the air. Danilo's expression went from predatory to enraged in a heartbeat. "You little bitch," he snarled and lunged forward. Morgana turned and ran. 3 floors above the staff tunnels, in a study where the air smelled like aged leather and expensive whiskey, Carmine Rizzo sat behind a desk that had cost more than most people earned a year. The room was all dark wood and muted gold, the kind of space that whispered power rather than shouting it. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 2 walls, filled with first editions and legal texts that had never been opened. A fireplace dominated the 3rd wall, flames crackling softly, casting dancing shadows across the Persian rug. Carmine wasn't looking at any of it. His attention was fixed on the property map spread across his desk, weighted down at the corners by a crystal tumbler and 3 leather-bound ledgers. The overhead light, a brass fixture with a green glass shade, illuminated the silver streaks at his temples. Threads of gray woven through black hair, slicked back with the kind of precision that took effort to achieve and maintain. At 38, Carmine Rizzo looked like what he was, a man who had built an empire through calculated violence and unshakable control. His navy 3-piece suit was immaculate, tailored in Milan by a craftsman who knew better than to keep records of the transaction. The white dress shirt beneath was crisp enough to cut, the top button undone, burgundy silk tie loosened just enough to suggest the late hour. Gold caught the light as he moved. The Rolex on his left wrist, heavy and obscenely expensive, the signet ring on his right hand, onyx set in gold, carved with the family crest. He was studying the map with the focus of a general planning a siege, one hand resting flat on the paper, the other holding a fountain pen that cost more than the average car payment. The map showed the estate boundaries, every building, every entrance, every vulnerable point where the property met the outside world. Red marks indicated recent security upgrades. Blue marks showed areas that still needed attention. Carmine ran this estate the way he ran everything, with absolute control and zero tolerance for chaos. Every person on this property, from the gardeners to the armed guards, existed within a structure he had designed. Every movement, every transaction, every breath taken within these walls happened because he allowed it to happen. It was a machine of his own making, and machines required maintenance, required attention, required a firm hand to keep all the parts moving in alignment. The pen moved across the map, circling a section near the east gate. The security reports had noted increased foot traffic from the neighboring property, a commercial development that was getting too curious about the Rizzo estate's business. Nothing aggressive yet, nothing that required immediate action, but Carmine didn't wait for problems to become emergencies. He dealt with potential disruptions before they had a chance to disrupt. His phone, a sleek black device face down on the desk, buzzed once. He ignored it. If it was important enough, they'd call back. If it wasn't, it could wait until he was finished. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney, and Carmine's eyes lifted briefly from the map. The study was on the 3rd floor, positioned precisely to give him a vantage point over the main entrance and the west gardens. The windows behind him were bulletproof, tinted just enough to prevent anyone from seeing in while allowing him to see out. Control of information was control of power. He could observe without being observed, could make decisions with complete awareness while others operated in the dark. He reached for the crystal tumbler, brought it to his lips, and took a slow sip of 18-year-old Macallan. The whiskey burned pleasantly, warming his throat, and he set the glass back down with deliberate care. Everything Carmine did was deliberate. Impulsive men died young in his line of work. Controlled men, patient men, men who thought 3 moves ahead, those were the men who built dynasties. The Rizzo family had been operating in this city for 4 generations, but it was Carmine who had elevated them from street-level enforcers to legitimate power brokers. He'd done it through a combination of brutal efficiency and strategic patience, knowing when to strike and when to wait, when to show mercy and when to make examples that would be remembered for years. His father had ruled through fear alone, a blunt instrument who believed that violence was the answer to every question. It had worked for a time until the old man had made one enemy too many and ended up with 3 bullets in his chest outside a restaurant he'd thought was secure. Carmine had been 26 when he took over, young by the standards of the organization, and there had been challenges. Men who thought his youth meant weakness. Men who thought they could carve out pieces of the empire for themselves. Those men had learned otherwise. Quickly. Permanently. Now, 12 years later, Carmine ruled an organization that stretched across 3 states, with interests in construction, waste management, shipping, and a dozen other industries that existed in the gray spaces between legal and illegal. He had judges on his payroll, politicians who returned his calls, and competitors who knew better than to encroach on Rizzo territory. And all of it, every piece of this carefully constructed machine, required his constant attention. The moment he stopped watching, the moment he let his guard down, someone would try to take what was his. It was the nature of power. It attracted ambition, and ambition attracted betrayal. The fountain pen moved across the map again, making a note near the staff quarters. Security had reported some minor tensions among the lower-level employees. Nothing specific, just the usual friction that came from putting too many people in too little space with too much stress. Carmine made a mental note to have his head of security address it. Small problems became large problems if ignored. Danilo Davide. The name surfaced in Carmine's mind with a flicker of something that wasn't quite irritation, but close to it. His head of security was effective, loyal, brutal when necessary. But lately there had been reports. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable, just whispers. Staff turnover in the housekeeping department had increased. 2 maids had quit in the past month without notice. The kitchen staff seemed nervous, more so than usual. Carmine didn't believe in coincidences. When patterns emerged, there was always a cause, and causes needed to be identified and addressed. He made another note on the map, this one near the security office. He'd have a conversation with Danilo. A quiet conversation. The kind that clarified expectations and reminded people that their positions existed at Carmine's pleasure and could be revoked just as easily. The room was silent except for the crackling fire and the soft scratch of pen on paper, but Carmine's attention had shifted. Something was off. Not wrong. Not yet, but off. It was a sense he'd developed over years of staying alive in a business where inattention was fatal. A sixth sense for disruption, for the moment when the machine he'd built encountered a problem. He set the pen down and went very still, listening. The study was insulated, soundproofed, deliberately isolated from the noise of the estate's daily operations. He shouldn't be able to hear anything from the floors below, and yet. There, faint but unmistakable, a metallic crash, echoing up through the ventilation system. The sound of something heavy hitting concrete. Then voices, raised, coming from somewhere in the staff areas. Carmine's eyes narrowed. The staff areas were supposed to be quiet at this hour. The dinner service was finished, the evening cleaning routines well underway. There shouldn't be shouting. There shouldn't be crashes. There should be the organized, efficient silence of people doing their jobs under the watchful eyes of supervisors who knew what happened when things got disorderly. He rose from his desk in one fluid motion, 6 feet and 2 inches of controlled power unfolding from the leather chair. His jacket hung on a coat stand near the door, and he pulled it on with practiced ease, settling it across his shoulders, adjusting the fit. The Rolex caught the light again as he checked the time. 5:47 p.m. The disruption continued. More voices now, male, aggressive, echoing up through the walls in a way that made Carmine's jaw tighten. Someone was breaking protocol. Someone was making noise, drawing attention, creating chaos in his carefully ordered world. And chaos, Carmine had learned long ago, was just another word for disrespect. He moved toward the door, his footsteps silent on the Persian rug, then louder on the hardwood floor of the hallway beyond. He didn't hurry. Carmine Rizzo never hurried. But he moved with purpose, with the absolute certainty of a man who knew that whatever was happening 3 floors below him was about to end the moment he arrived. Because in the Rizzo estate, there was only one law, and that law was walking down the stairs. Morgana's lungs burned as she sprinted through the staff corridor, her shoes slapping against the concrete in a rhythm that sounded like panic. Behind her, she could hear them. Heavy boots, multiple sets, laughter that echoed off the walls like something from a nightmare. "Run, little mouse." Danilo's voice boomed through the tunnel, slurred but deadly. "Makes it more fun." She didn't look back. Looking back meant slowing down, and slowing down meant they'd catch her. Her mind was racing faster than her feet, calculating distances, mapping routes, searching desperately for an escape that didn't exist. The main corridor led to the kitchen, but that meant witnesses, meant other staff members who would look away, because looking away was how you survived in the Rizzo estate. A door appeared on her left. Gray metal, unmarked, the kind of door you walk past 100 times without noticing. The utility room. Small, rarely used, just a storage space for overflow supplies that didn't fit in the main inventory areas. It was an exit, but maybe if she could get inside and lock the door, maybe they'd lose interest and move on. It was a stupid hope, the kind born of desperation, but it was all she had. Morgana grabbed the handle, yanked it open, and threw herself inside. The room was exactly as bad as she remembered. 8 feet square, maybe less, lined with metal shelving units bolted to the walls. Boxes of industrial cleaning supplies, bottles of chemicals, stacks of rags. A single fluorescent tube in the ceiling flickered and hummed, casting everything in a sickly greenish light. The air smelled like ammonia and rust. Her hands found the door handle, tried to pull it closed, but it was too late. The door exploded inward with enough force to send her stumbling backward. Danilo filled the frame, his pale face flushed dark with alcohol and exertion, cold blue eyes locked on her like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Behind him, the other security staff crowded in the corridor, backlit by the harsh fluorescent lights, their faces obscured by shadow. "End of the line, Mouse," Danilo said, his voice thick with satisfaction. He stepped inside, and the small room became a cage. Morgana backed up until her spine hit the shelving unit. Bottles rattled. Something fell and rolled across the floor. She couldn't take her eyes off him. 6 feet and 1 inch of muscle and menace, moving toward her with the casual confidence of someone who knew there was nowhere left to run. "Mr. Davide, please." Her voice came out strangled, barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean any disrespect. I was just scared. I'm sorry. Sorry," he repeated, almost thoughtful. He was close enough now that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, could see the broken blood vessels in his nose, the cruel curve of his mouth. "You know what sorry gets you in this house, Mouse? Absolutely nothing." His hand shot out faster than she could react, grabbing her wrist with crushing force. Morgana cried out, tried to pull away, but he was so much stronger. He yanked her forward, off balance, then shoved her backward into the shelving unit so hard that her teeth clacked together and stars exploded across her vision. "You think you're special." Danilo's face was inches from hers now, his free hand coming up to brace against the shelf beside her head, boxing her in. "You think you can just walk through my house, ignoring me, disrespecting me, and there won't be consequences? It's not your house," Morgana gasped, the words escaping before her survival instinct could stop them. The slap came so fast she didn't see it. Pain exploded across her cheek, whipping her head to the side. Her ear rang. Blood filled her mouth where her teeth had cut the inside of her lip. "Wrong answer." Danilo's voice had dropped to something cold and quiet, which somehow made it worse. "Everything in this estate belongs to the Rizzo family, and I'm the one who decides who gets protected and who gets taught a lesson. Right now, Mouse, you're in the second category." He pressed closer, using his height and weight to pin her completely against the shelving unit. Morgana could feel the cold steel digging in her back, the sharp edge of a shelf cutting into her shoulder blade. She tried to push against his chest, but it was like pushing against a wall. Her hands might as well have been pushing air for all the effect it had. "Get off me." She tried to make it a command, but it came out as a plea. Danilo laughed, low and guttural, the sound of someone enjoying himself. His hand released her wrist and moved to her throat, not squeezing, just resting there, a reminder of how easy it would be. How quickly he could crush her windpipe if he wanted to. How utterly powerless she was. See, that's the problem with you new girls. You don't understand how things work. You think the rules that existed out there, in whatever sad little life you ran away from, you think those rules apply here. His thumb pressed against her pulse point, feeling it hammer frantically against his skin. They don't. Here, there's only one rule. Do what you're told, when you're told, by who you're told. And I'm telling you right now, Mouse, you belong to me. Morgana felt tears burning in her eyes, rage and terror mixing into something that tasted like copper. She thought of Sophia, waiting for her, counting on her. She thought of the envelope of cash hidden in her mattress. She thought of 8 months that now seemed like an eternity, an impossible distance she'd never survive crossing. Please, she whispered, hating herself for begging, but unable to stop. Please, I need this job. I'll stay out of your way. I'll be invisible. Just let me work. Invisible, Danilo repeated, his smile widening. That ship has sailed, sweetheart. You got my attention, and now you're going to learn what happens when you try to pull away from it. His other hand moved from the shelf to her jaw, gripping it roughly, forcing her to look at him. His fingers dug into her skin hard enough to bruise. Morgana could feel her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. There was movement in the doorway. A flash of white. Morgana's eyes darted past Danilo's shoulder and caught a glimpse of Maria, the older cook, standing in the corridor. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Maria's face was gray with fear, her hand pressed to her mouth. Help! Morgana tried to say, but Danilo's hand tightened on her jaw, cutting off the word. Maria looked away. She turned and fled, her footsteps echoing down the corridor, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. No one was coming. No one was going to help. They all knew better. That's right, Danilo said, having seen the exchange. No one's coming for you, Mouse. No one gives a damn what happens in this room. You're mine now, and the sooner you accept that, the easier this will be. His hand moved from her jaw to her hair, fingers tangling in the dark strands that had come loose from her bun. He yanked hard, forcing her head back, exposing her throat. Morgana felt a scream building in her chest, but terror had locked her vocal cords. The fluorescent light above flickered again, casting shadows that made Danilo's face look monstrous. His breath was hot against her neck as he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. You're going to learn respect, Mouse, and I'm going to enjoy teaching you. Then everything stopped. Not gradually, not with a warning. It stopped the way a movie stops when someone hits pause. Danilo's hand was still in her hair, his body still pressed against hers, but he'd gone completely rigid. The temperature in the room dropped so fast Morgana could see her breath. The sickly green light from the fluorescent tube seemed to dim, swallowed by shadows that hadn't been there a second ago. And then she smelled it. Expensive cologne, something with notes of sandalwood and leather, cutting through the ammonia and fear like a knife through silk. Danilo's hand loosened fractionally in her hair. His breathing had changed, shallow and quick, the breathing of someone who just realized they'd made a catastrophic mistake. Boss, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Morgana's eyes moved past Danilo's shoulder to the doorway he'd been blocking, and her breath caught in her throat. Carmine Rizzo stood in the entrance, backlit by the corridor lights, his shadow stretching across the concrete floor like something alive. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, 6 feet and 2 inches of absolute authority in a navy suit that probably cost more than Morgana would earn in a year, his piercing green eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him with the cold precision of a surgeon examining a tumor. The silence in that tiny utility room was deafening. Carmine didn't move from the doorway, and somehow that stillness was more terrifying than any action could have been. He simply stood there, his presence filling the small space with a weight that had nothing to do with physical mass and everything to do with power. The kind of power that didn't need to announce itself because everyone within 100 yards could feel it like a change in air pressure before a storm. Danilo's hand was still tangled in Morgana's hair, but his grip had gone slack. His body, which moments ago had been pressed against hers with predatory confidence, was now rigid with something Morgana had never expected to see from him. Fear. Pure, animal fear that made his breathing shallow and his skin go from flush to pale in the space of a heartbeat. Boss, Danilo said again, the word coming out rough. There was a situation with one of the staff. Disciplinary issue. I was handling it. Carmine's eyes moved slowly from Danilo to Morgana, pinned against the shelving unit with tears streaking her face and blood at the corner of her mouth. Those green eyes took in every detail with the precision of a man who missed nothing. The red mark on her cheek where Danilo had slapped her. The way her uniform was disheveled, one sleeve torn at the shoulder. The terror in her dark brown eyes that hadn't diminished with his arrival, because she didn't know yet if his presence made things better or infinitely worse. Then those eyes moved back to Danilo, and the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. Carmine still didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence itself was a weapon, stretching out between them like a blade being slowly drawn from its sheath. Every second that passed without words was another turn of the screw, another layer of dread settling over Danilo like a burial shroud. Behind Carmine, in the corridor, the other security staff who had been laughing and jeering just minutes ago were frozen like statues. They'd heard the boss's footsteps too late to warn Danilo. Those expensive black leather shoes on marble making sounds too soft to carry over Danilo's shouting and Morgana's muffled cries. But Maria had heard. Maria had seen Carmine descending the back stairs, had understood in an instant what was about to happen, and the terror on her face had been the only warning Danilo received. Too little. Too late. "Sir, I can't explain," Danilo started, his hand finally releasing Morgana's hair. He took a step back, trying to put distance between himself and the evidence of what he'd been doing, but there was nowhere to go. The utility room was 8 feet square, and Carmine's presence had somehow made it even smaller. Carmine raised one hand just slightly. Not a dramatic gesture, barely a movement at all, but Danilo's mouth snapped shut like he'd been struck. That was the power Carmine Rizzo wielded. A raised finger could silence a man more effectively than a shout ever could. The overhead fluorescent continued its sickly flicker, casting everything in alternating shadow and light. Carmine took one step into the room. Just one. The expensive fabric of his suit caught the light, navy wool perfectly tailored to his frame. His Rolex glinted gold. The signet ring on his right hand, carved with the family crest, seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had never hurried for anything in his life, who understood that true power didn't rush because true power didn't need to. Time bent around him. The world waited for Carmine Rizzo, not the other way around. Morgana pressed harder against the shelving unit, trying to make herself smaller, invisible, anything to avoid drawing those green eyes back to her. But she couldn't look away. She was transfixed, watching this man who commanded absolute fear with nothing more than his presence, wondering if he was her salvation or just a different flavor of nightmare. "How long has she been working here?" Carmine's voice, when it finally came, was quiet, conversational almost, the kind of tone someone might use to ask about the weather. But there was something underneath it, something cold and sharp as a scalpel, that made Morgana's breath catch in her throat. "5 days, boss," Danilo answered quickly. Too quickly. The words tumbling over themselves in his desperation to appear cooperative, useful, anything but what he actually was. 5 days, Carmine repeated, his gaze moving around the small room, taking in the scattered cleaning supplies, the broken bottle on the floor, the way Morgana was clutching her torn sleeve with white-knuckled fingers. "And in those 5 days, what impression do you think she's formed of how we conduct business in this house?" It was a rhetorical question. Danilo seemed to understand that, because he didn't answer. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words he didn't dare release. "Do you think," Carmine continued, his tone still maddeningly calm, "that she's going to tell her friends what a professional, well-run organization this is? Do you think she's going to speak highly of the Rizzo estate's treatment of its staff?" "She won't say anything," Danilo said, and there was a desperate edge to his voice now. "I'll make sure she understands the consequences of talking. I'll handle it. You'll handle it." Carmine's head tilted slightly, like he was considering this. "The way you were handling it when I walked in." Danilo's face flushed dark red. "Boss, she disrespected me. She refused a direct order. She ran. I was establishing authority, making sure she understood the hierarchy. The hierarchy..." Carmine took another step into the room. Now, there were only a few feet separating him from Danilo, and Morgana could see her attacker's hands starting to tremble. Tell me, Danilo, where do you fall in that hierarchy? I'm head of security, boss. I answer directly to you. You answer to me, Carmine agreed. Which means every action you take, every order you give, every decision you make reflects on me, on my house, on my family's reputation. His eyes moved back to Morgana, still pressed against the shelving, and then returned to Danilo. So, when you corner a 5'4" maid in a storage room and put your hands on her, whose authority are you actually representing? The question hung in the air like a noose. Sir, I didn't think. No, Carmine interrupted, his voice still quiet but somehow harder, like steel wrapped in silk. You didn't think. That's the problem. You thought your position gave you certain privileges. You thought that because you carry my authority, you could use it however you wanted. You forgot something very important. He paused, letting the silence stretch again. Morgana could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Danilo's rapid breathing, could hear the fluorescent light buzzing overhead like an angry insect. You forgot, Carmine continued, that authority isn't yours to abuse. It's mine to grant, and mine to revoke. Danilo's face had gone from red to gray. Boss, please. It won't happen again. I swear. I'll apologize. I'll transfer to a different shift. Whatever you want. What I want, Carmine said. And now there was something in his voice that made Morgana's skin crawl, something that suggested the civilized veneer was very thin, and what lay beneath it was far more dangerous than Danilo's crude brutality, is for you to step away from her. Now, Danilo moved immediately, stumbling backward, putting the full width of the small room between himself and Morgana. His back hit the opposite wall, and he stayed there, arms at his sides, trying to make himself smaller. Carmine's eyes never left him. The men in the hallway. Send them back to their posts. Then you go to my office and wait for me there. Don't speak to anyone. Don't stop anywhere. Just go to my office and wait. Do you understand? Yes, boss. Absolutely. Right away. Danilo was already moving toward the door, eager to escape, to put distance between himself and the judgment he could feel coming. Danilo. Carmine's voice stopped him at the threshold. Yes, boss. If you run, I'll know. And that will make things much worse for you. Danilo's face somehow got paler. I won't run, boss. I'll be in your office. He disappeared into the corridor. Morgana could hear him barking orders at the other security staff, his voice trying to regain some of its earlier authority and failing miserably. Footsteps echoed away down the concrete tunnel, growing fainter until there was silence again. And then Morgana was alone in the utility room with Carmine Rizzo, and she honestly didn't know if that was better or worse. Carmine remained in the center of the small space, hands clasped loosely in front of him, his posture relaxed in a way that somehow made him more intimidating rather than less. He wasn't looking at her. Not yet. His eyes were fixed on the doorway where Danilo had disappeared, his expression utterly unreadable. Not angry, not disgusted, just considering, like he was working through a complex equation in his head, weighing variables, calculating outcomes. The silence stretched. Morgana didn't dare move, didn't dare speak. Her back was still pressed against the shelving unit, her hand still clutching her torn sleeve, her face still throbbing where Danilo had struck her. She could feel blood drying at the corner of her mouth, could taste copper on her tongue. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to run, but her legs felt like they'd been bolted to the floor. This was Carmine Rizzo, the man who owned this estate, who commanded an organization that stretched across 3 states, who had built an empire on a foundation of controlled violence and absolute authority. She'd only seen him once before, from a distance, moving through the main house with an entourage of suited men who cleared a path before him like he was royalty. Up close, he was more terrifying than she'd imagined. Not because he looked dangerous, though the tattoos that covered his arms suggested a history of violence, but because of the stillness, the complete, total control he maintained over every muscle, every breath, every micro-expression. Men like Danilo were dangerous because they were volatile, unpredictable, driven by base impulses they barely controlled. But Carmine Rizzo was dangerous because there was nothing base about him. Everything was calculated, measured, precise. He was still looking at the doorway, his jaw working slightly like he was chewing on something distasteful. The overhead light caught the silver streaks in his black hair, made his green eyes look almost luminous in the sickly fluorescent glow. The navy suit fit him like it had been painted on, not a wrinkle, not a hair out of place. Even his tie was still perfectly knotted, burgundy silk hanging at exactly the right length. Morgana realized with a start that she was staring at him, cataloging details her mind insisted were important for reasons she couldn't articulate. The way his hands weren't just clasped but positioned precisely, right hand over left, the signet ring visible. The way he stood with his weight slightly forward, balanced on the balls of his feet like a fighter. The way his breathing was so controlled it was almost imperceptible, chest barely rising and falling beneath the tailored vest. 5 days, he said finally, his voice quiet enough that Morgana had a strain to hear it. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to himself, working through whatever calculation he'd been running in his head. 5 days, and already this kind of disruption. He turned then, slowly, and his eyes found hers. Morgana felt the impact of that gaze like a physical thing. Green eyes that saw everything, missed nothing, stripped away whatever defenses she might have had, and examined what lay beneath with the detachment of scientists studying a specimen. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. It would have felt like breaking some unspoken rule, like showing weakness to something that fed on weakness. Are you hurt? The question came out flat, clinical. Not concerned exactly, but assessing, like he was inventorying damage. Morgana touched her cheek reflexively, winced at the tenderness there. I'm okay. That wasn't what I asked. His tone didn't change. Are you hurt? Do you require medical attention? No, sir. I don't think so. She gestured vaguely at her face, at her torn sleeve. Just bruises. Carmine nodded once, filing the information away. His eyes moved over her again, not in the way Danilo's had, not with hunger or possession, but with that same clinical assessment. Checking for injuries, evaluating the extent of the damage. His expression never shifted from that neutral, considering mask. Inside his mind, behind those green eyes, Carmine was running through scenarios with the speed and precision that had kept him alive for 38 years in a business where most men died young. This was a problem, not a crisis, not yet, but definitely a problem that required handling. The kind of problem that festered if left untended, that spread through an organization like rot through wood. Danilo Davide had been with the family for 6 years. Competent, mostly. Loyal, as far as loyalty went in this business. Brutal when brutality was required, which in security work was often. But this was different. This wasn't brutality in service of the organization. This was personal indulgence masquerading as authority. This was a dog that had fouled the kennel because it forgot that the kennel wasn't its own. And the girl, 5'4", maybe 110 pounds soaking wet, dark hair, dark eyes, the kind of delicate features that made men like Danilo think she was easy prey. She'd been here 5 days. 5 days, and already she'd become target. That said something about her, or about the environment he'd allowed to develop in the staff quarters. Neither option was acceptable. The practical considerations cycled through his mind with mechanical efficiency. If Danilo had succeeded, if Maria hadn't fled and alerted him through her panic, what would have happened? The girl would have been assaulted. She would have either quit immediately, creating questions about why another maid had left so suddenly, or she would have stayed and become a walking liability. Bitter, angry, potentially talkative with the wrong people. One conversation with a sympathetic bartender or a concerned friend, and suddenly there were police asking questions, lawyers getting interested, attention being drawn to an estate that operated best in shadow. And even if none of that happened, even if she stayed silent, Danilo would have learned the wrong lesson. He would have understood that he could act with impunity, that his position gave him license to take what he wanted. Other security staff would have seen it, learned from it, assumed they had the same privileges. The rot would spread. No, this couldn't stand. Not because it was wrong, though Carmine's personal code, complex and often contradictory as it was, found the scene he'd interrupted distasteful, but because it was bad business, because it represented a fundamental breakdown in the order he'd established, because it demonstrated that someone in his organization, someone he'd elevated to a position of authority, had forgotten who held the leash. Carmine didn't keep dogs that forgot they were dogs. His eyes refocused on Morgana, who was still pressed against the shelving like she was trying to phase through the metal and disappear. She was shaking, he noted clinically, small tremors running through her frame, shock setting in now that the immediate danger had passed, or what she perceived as the immediate danger. She didn't understand yet that Danilo had never been the real threat in this room. "What's your name?" He kept his voice level, conversational. "Morgana, sir. Morgana Piazza. Morgana." He tested the name, filing it away with all the other information. "How did you come to work here?" The employment agency. "In the city. They said you needed household staff." And before that, she hesitated, and Carmine saw the calculation flash across her face. How much to tell? How much was safe? He could have told her that nothing was safe, that he'd have her full background within an hour if he wanted it, but he was curious what she'd choose to reveal. "I worked in hospitality. Hotels, mostly. Housekeeping. Why leave?" Another hesitation. "I needed better pay. No questions asked about why I needed cash." Interesting. So she was running from something. Or someone. It explained the nervousness, the hypervigilance, the desperate attempt to be invisible. She'd come here seeking anonymity, seeking a place where she could disappear into the background and collect untraceable money. Instead, she'd painted a target on herself by being exactly what men like Danilo looked for. Vulnerable, isolated, afraid. "You have family?" The question came out sharper than he'd intended. "A sister. She's back home. With family." The lie was obvious in how quickly she said it, how her eyes darted away. So, a sister she was protecting. That was why she needed the money, why she'd taken a job in a place like this despite clearly being terrified of it. Desperation made people do stupid things, made them walk into cages and pull the door shut behind them. Carmine weighed his options. He could send her away with a severance payment, get her off the property before she became a bigger problem. Clean. Simple. But then Danilo would interpret that as evidence that he'd been right to push, that the girl had been weak, that next time he just needed to be more careful about not getting caught. Or he could keep her here, make her visible in a way that sent a very different message. Make it clear that she wasn't prey, that touching her meant crossing a line that would have consequences. The second option was messier, more complicated. It meant assuming responsibility for her safety, which meant resources allocated, attention paid, another variable to track in the complex equation that was running the estate. But it also meant establishing a new precedent, reinforcing the rules, reminding everyone that authority came from him and only him, and that anyone who forgot that would learn otherwise. Carmine made his decision with the speed that had always served him well. "You'll continue working here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But there will be changes to your assignment." Morgana's mouth opened, then closed. She didn't understand what was happening, couldn't process whether this was mercy or something else entirely. Her mind was still caught in the trap of survival mode, unable to think beyond the next 5 minutes, the next breath. "Sir, You don't need to understand right now," Carmine interrupted. "You need to go to the staff medical room. Have someone look at your face. Document the injuries. Then go to your quarters and stay there until someone from my office contacts you tomorrow. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." The words came automatically, muscle memory from years of taking orders from people in positions of power. "Good." Carmine pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his inside jacket pocket, the kind that probably cost more than her entire uniform. He held out to her. "For your mouth." Morgana took it with trembling fingers, pressed it to her split lip. The fabric was impossibly soft, probably silk. It seemed obscene to bleed on something that expensive, but Carmine was already turning away, his attention shifting to the doorway, to the corridor beyond, to whatever came next in the calculation he was running. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was thanking him for. For stopping Danilo? For not firing her? For not being worse than what she'd already survived tonight? Carmine didn't acknowledge the thanks. He was already moving toward the door, his footsteps deliberate, unhurried. He paused at the threshold, turned his head slightly without looking back at her. "One more thing, Morgana. What happened in this room tonight, the conversation we just had, stays between us. You don't discuss it with other staff. You don't tell your sister. You don't write it in a diary. It didn't happen. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Then get out of here. Maria should still be in the kitchen. Have her take you to medical." He disappeared into the corridor, and Morgana was alone in the utility room with nothing but the flickering fluorescent light and the sound of her own ragged breathing. Her legs finally remembered how to work, and she pushed away from the shelving unit, stumbling toward the door on feet that felt like they belonged to someone else. The corridor was empty except for the distant sound of kitchen work, pots clanging, water running, the familiar sounds of the estate continuing its evening routines like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. Morgana pressed the silk handkerchief to her mouth and walked. 3 floors above, Carmine moved through the marble hallways with the same measured pace he'd maintained in the utility room. Staff members scattered when they saw him coming, pressing themselves against walls, averting their eyes. They knew better than to be in his path when he wore that expression, the one that said someone was about to learn a very painful lesson. His office was in the East Wing, a corner room with windows that overlooked the gardens and the distant city lights. The door was solid mahogany, heavy enough to muffle any sounds that might come from inside. He pushed it open without knocking. It was his office. He didn't knock. Danilo was standing in the center of the room, his posture rigid, hands clasped behind his back in a parody of military attention. The cocky confidence from the utility room was gone, replaced by a brittle wariness that made him look years older. His pale face was shiny with sweat, and his eyes tracked Carmine's movement like a trapped animal watching a predator circle closer. "Boss, I want to explain." Danilo started the moment the door closed. Carmine held up one hand, and Danilo's mouth snapped shut. The silence that followed was absolute. Carmine moved to his desk, a massive piece of furniture carved from dark wood, positioned to give him a clear view of the entire room. He didn't sit. Instead, he braced his hands on the desk surface, his weight forward, his green eyes locked on Danilo with the kind of focus that made grown men confess to crimes they hadn't committed. "You were going to explain," Carmine said softly. "Let me save you the effort. You were going to tell me that the girl disrespected you, that she needed to learn her place, that you were just establishing authority, maintaining discipline, doing your job. Does that about cover it?" Danilo's throat worked. "Yes, boss. Exactly. I was just. You were just assaulting a 5'4" maid in a storage room because you thought your position gave you the right." Carmine's voice remained quiet, conversational. "You thought that because you answered to me, you could do whatever you wanted as long as no one important saw. You thought wrong. Boss, it wasn't like that. She's been avoiding me, disrespecting me in front of the other staff. I needed to make an example, show that. An example." Carmine straightened slowly, his hands leaving the desk. "You wanted to make an example. So tell me, Danilo, what example were you making? That the Rizzo estate protects predators who attack vulnerable employees? That security staff can abuse their positions without consequences? That this organization tolerates chaos as long as it happens in the back rooms, where I'm not supposed to see it?" "No, boss. That's not." Danilo's voice cracked. "I was maintaining order, keeping the staff in line. That's my job." "Your job," Carmine said, each word precise as a scalpel cut, "is to protect this estate, to maintain security, to ensure that operations run smoothly and that problems are handled with discretion and professionalism. Your job is not to corner terrified maids and put your hands on them because they don't smile when you walk by." He was moving now, circling around the desk, closing the distance between himself and Danilo with the inevitability of a closing trap. Danilo shifted his weight, his hands coming up slightly, not aggressive but defensive, the instinct of someone who sensed violence coming and didn't know how to stop it. Boss, please, I can fix this. I'll apologize to the girl. I'll transfer. I'll do whatever you want. Just give me another chance. Another chance. Carmine stopped 6 feet away, just outside what most people would consider personal space, but close enough that Danilo had to tilt his head slightly to maintain eye contact. How many chances do you think you deserve? How many times should I overlook you treating my property like your personal hunting ground? It won't happen again, Danilo said desperately. I swear, boss. I lost my head. The whiskey, the stress, I made a mistake. You made a choice. Carmine's voice dropped even lower, that dangerous quiet that made Danilo's breathing accelerate. You chose to abuse your authority. You chose to create a liability. You chose to disrespect me by doing it under my roof. And now I have to choose how to respond. Danilo's hands were shaking now. He clasped them together, trying to hide it, but Carmine saw everything. Fear was useful. Fear meant the lesson was landing. But fear alone wasn't enough. Fear faded. Pain and consequence, those had staying power. Take your hands off her. The command came so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that Danilo blinked in confusion. What? In the utility room. When I told you to take your hands off her. Do you remember what you did? Danilo's face went gray. I stepped back. I did what you said. You hesitated. Carmine's eyes were like chips of ice. For 2 full seconds, you hesitated. You stood there with your hand in her hair, and you had to think about whether or not you were going to obey a direct order from me. Do you understand what that tells me about your judgment? About your priorities? Boss, I was just surprised. I didn't mean to. Danilo's right hand moved, just slightly, adjusting his stance, and that was the mistake. Carmine read the movement for what it was, the unconscious shift of someone whose body was preparing for fight or flight, someone whose hindbrain had already decided that words weren't going to be enough to get out of this situation. Carmine moved with a speed that belied his size and his tailored suit. One moment he was 6 feet away, the next his hand had Danilo's right wrist in a grip like a vice. The movement was so fast, so precise, that Danilo didn't even have time to react before Carmine twisted, a sharp rotation that forced Danilo's arm up and back at an angle that human joints weren't designed to accommodate. Danilo's mouth opened to shout, but Carmine's other hand came up, fingers finding the pressure point at the base of Danilo's throat, not crushing but pressing with surgical precision. The shout died before it began, reduced to a strangled wheeze. This, Carmine said calmly, his face inches from Danilo's now, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing the weather, is what happens when you hesitate to follow orders. This is what happens when you forget that everything you have, every bit of authority you wield, comes from me and can be taken away just as easily. He applied more pressure to the wrist, and something in Danilo's shoulder joint made a wet popping sound. Not a break, not quite, but a dislocation that would take weeks to heal properly. Danilo's legs buckled, his weight sagging against Carmine's grip, his face contorted in agony. Carmine held him there for another 2 seconds, making sure the lesson landed, making sure Danilo understood exactly how much control he just lost. Then he released both grips simultaneously and stepped back. Danilo collapsed to the floor like a puppet with cut strings, his right arm hanging useless at his side, his left hand clutching at his shoulder. Sounds came from his throat, animal whimpers of pain that he couldn't quite suppress. His face had gone from gray to white, and sweat poured down his forehead, dripping onto the expensive Persian rug. Carmine looked down at him with the same clinical detachment he'd shown in the utility room, like he was examining a malfunctioning piece of equipment that had just been repaired. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his jacket, checked his Rolex. The entire sequence had taken less than 5 seconds and hadn't even wrinkled his suit. "You're done as head of security," Carmine said. "Effective immediately. You'll work in the warehouse district, inventory management, until I decide what to do with you permanently. Your pay is cut by 40%. You go nowhere near the main house or any female staff member for any reason. Break any of these rules, and what I just did to your shoulder will seem like a massage. Are we clear?" Danilo, still on the floor, managed a jerky nod, his face twisted in pain. "I asked if we were clear." "Yes, boss," Danilo gasped. Crystal clear. Good. Get out of my office. Have someone in medical look at that shoulder. And Danilo. Carmine's voice stopped him as he struggled to his feet, cradling his useless arm. Thank whatever God you believe in that I was in a merciful mood tonight. Danilo stumbled toward the door, his left hand pressed against his dislocated shoulder, his face gray with pain and shock. He fumbled with the door handle, nearly dropped to his knees again, then finally managed to wrench it open and disappear into the hallway. The sound of his uneven footsteps faded, punctuated by sharp intakes of breath that might have been sobs. Carmine stood in the center of his office, perfectly still, his breathing as controlled as it had been before the violence. He looked down at his hands, flexed his fingers once, then smoothed his jacket again. Not a hair out of place, not a wrinkle in the fabric. The only evidence that anything had happened was a faint sheen on his right palm, where he'd gripped Danilo's wrist. He pulled the handkerchief from his pocket, wiped his hand clean, then tucked the cloth away again. The handkerchief was ruined now, stained with Danilo's sweat and fear. He'd have to burn it. Small price to pay for maintaining order. He moved to his desk, pressed the intercom button. Send Marcus to my office. Immediately. Marcus arrived within 90 seconds, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with iron gray hair and the kind of face that had seen everything and been surprised by none of it. He'd been with the Rizzo family for 20 years, had worked his way up from street enforcement to head of estate operations through a combination of competence and absolute discretion. Boss! Marcus closed the door behind him, his eyes quickly scanning the room, noting the way the Persian rug was slightly rumpled, the way the air still carried the faint scent of fierce sweat. Danilo Davide is no longer head of security. He's been reassigned to inventory management in the warehouse district. 40% pay cut. You'll take over his position effective immediately. Marcus's expression didn't change. Understood. Should I ask what happened? No. Will he be a problem going forward? Carmine considered this. Danilo was ambitious, resentful, the kind of man who would nurse a grudge like a precious wound. But he was also smart enough to know that challenging Carmine directly was suicide. The real question was whether he was smart enough to know that indirect challenges were just suicide with extra steps. Monitor him, Carmine said finally. If he steps out of line, deal with it. Permanently. Marcus nodded. He'd been given permission to kill if necessary, and they both understood that without it needing to be stated explicitly. The staff will have questions about why he was reassigned. Then give them an answer that doesn't invite more questions. Tell them he failed to meet performance standards. Tell them there was a disciplinary issue. Tell them whatever you need to tell them to keep operations running smoothly. And the girl? The new maid. Morgana Piazza. Carmine's eyes sharpened. Marcus had already done his homework, already knew which staff member had triggered this chain of events. That was why he was being promoted. She's to be reassigned. No more back corridors, no more utility rooms. She'll work the main house, public areas only, during hours when I'm present. I want her visible. I want everyone to see that she's under my protection. Marcus's face remained neutral, but Carmine caught the slight tension around his eyes. Protection meant liability. Protection meant resources allocated. Protection meant complications. Is that going to be a problem? Carmine asked, his tone making it clear there was only one acceptable answer. No, boss. I'll make the arrangements. Good. And Marcus? She doesn't need to know the details. She just needs to know that things have changed and that she's safe as long as she does her job and keeps her mouth shut. Understood. Carmine dismissed him with a slight nod, and Marcus left as efficiently as he'd arrived. Alone again, Carmine returned to his desk, but he didn't sit. His mind was already 3 moves ahead, anticipating consequences, planning responses to problems that hadn't emerged yet but would. Danilo would be resentful. That resentment would fester. In 6 months, maybe a year, he'd do something stupid, something that would require Carmine to finish what he'd started tonight. Better to have Marcus monitoring him, ready to act the moment that stupidity manifested. The girl, Morgana, she was now a known quantity in the organization. Staff would talk. They'd speculate about why a new maid was suddenly working the main house, why she had the boss's protection. Some would assume she was sleeping with him. Others would assume she had information, leverage, something valuable. All of that attention was dangerous for her and inconvenient for him. But it was necessary, because the alternative was letting Danilo's behavior stand unchallenged, letting the rot spread, letting his authority be undermined by the casual violence of men who forgot they were extensions of his will, not independent actors. He'd made the right choice. He was certain of it. But right choices still came with costs, and those costs would have to be managed. Carmine pulled out his phone, sent a brief text message to his personal physician. Someone needed to check on Morgana, document her injuries properly, make sure there were no complications. Not because he cared about her well-being, though he wasn't actively indifferent to it, but because medical documentation was insurance. If she ever became a problem, if she ever tried to talk to police or lawyers, those records would show that he'd provided immediate care, that he'd handled the situation appropriately. Everything was about insurance. Everything was about control. His phone buzzed with a response. The doctor would be at the estate within the hour. Good. One more variable locked down, one more potential problem addressed before it could metastasize. Carmine finally sat, pulled the property map back toward him, but his attention wasn't on it. He was thinking about the look in Morgana's eyes when he'd found her in that utility room. Terror, yes, but also something else. A kind of desperate calculation, the look of someone who was used to surviving impossible situations through sheer force of will. She reminded him of someone. It took him a moment to place who, and when he did, something cold settled in his chest. She reminded him of his mother, in the days before his father's violence had finally broken her completely. That same mix of fear and defiance, that same determination to protect something precious, even when protection meant sacrificing yourself. His mother had been trying to protect him. Morgana was trying to protect someone too. The sister she'd mentioned, the one she'd lied about so transparently. That was her weakness, her vulnerability, the thing that had driven her into his world despite clearly being terrified of it. Carmine filed that information away. Weaknesses were useful. They could be leveraged when necessary, exploited when expedient. But they could also be protected if protecting them served a larger purpose. He'd decide which approach to take with Morgana Piazza after he saw how the next few days played out. After he saw whether she was smart enough to accept her new reality or stupid enough to fight against it. For now, she was a piece on the board, positioned in a way that sent a message to everyone else in the organization. Touch her, and you answer to me. Disrespect her, and you're disrespecting my authority. It was a message that needed sending. Danilo's behavior hadn't developed in a vacuum. It had been enabled by a culture that Carmine had allowed to develop through inattention. Other staff members had seen him corner women, had heard stories, had known what was happening, and said nothing because saying something meant putting yourself in the crosshairs. That ended tonight. Carmine's phone buzzed again. Marcus, with a brief update. Danilo was in the medical room getting his shoulder examined. The staff were being informed of the leadership change. Morgana had been located and escorted to her quarters by Maria, who was making sure she ate something and didn't go into shock. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The machine was recalibrating, adjusting to the new parameters he'd established. Carmine allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, rare and brief, before returning his attention to the property map. There was still work to do. There was always work to do. But at least now, one source of potential chaos had been addressed. He didn't need to worry about Morgana Piazza anymore. She was his responsibility now, his liability, his problem to manage. And Carmine Rizzo was very, very good at managing problems. The estate settled into its evening rhythms, the kind of deceptive quiet that suggested peace, but was really just the absence of visible violence. In the staff quarters, Morgana sat on her narrow bed, holding an ice pack to her face, trying to process what had happened. In the medical room, Danilo bit down on a leather strap while the estate doctor manipulated his shoulder back into place, each pop of cartilage a physical reminder of his mistake. And in his office, Carmine Rizzo returned to his maps and ledgers, secure in the knowledge that his authority remained absolute, his control unquestioned, his empire running exactly as he designed it to run. For now. For days passed like a fever dream Morgana couldn't quite wake from. The first morning after the incident, she'd expected to be fired. Or worse, she'd lain in her narrow bed in the staff quarters, staring at the water-stained ceiling, waiting for the knock on her door that would summon her to some final reckoning. Instead, what came was Maria, carrying a breakfast tray with actual food instead of the usual stale bread and weak coffee. Toast with butter, scrambled eggs, fresh orange juice. Eat, Maria had said, her weathered face unreadable. Mr. Marcus wants to see you at 9. Marcus had been professional, almost gentle. Her reassignment was explained in terms that made it sound like a promotion rather than protective custody. She'd be working the main house now. Public rooms, guest suites, the grand hallways where family and associates moved. Better hours, better pay. The implication, never stated but impossible to miss, was that she'd be visible. That visibility meant safety, or it meant she was being watched. Morgana couldn't decide which interpretation scared her more. Now, on her 5th day in the new assignment, she was polishing the marble banister of the main staircase, a grand sweep of white stone that curved up to the 2nd floor like something from a palace. The morning light streamed through tall windows, catching the crystal chandelier overhead and scattering rainbow fragments across the walls. It was beautiful. It was also completely exposed. She could feel eyes on her constantly. The other staff members watched her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. They didn't speak to her anymore, not the way they had during her first few days. No more casual conversations in the break room. No more shared complaints about Mrs. Chen's impossible standards. Now they gave her space, treated her like she was contaminated with something they didn't want to catch. Or maybe like she was protected by something they didn't want to anger. Word had spread. Of course it had. In a place like this, secrets lasted about as long as ice in summer. Everyone knew that Danilo had been reassigned, that his shoulder was in a sling, that he'd been seen leaving the boss's office looking like a man who'd glimpsed his own death. Everyone knew that Morgana had been moved to the main house immediately after. The connection wasn't subtle. What they didn't know, what Morgana was grateful they didn't know, was exactly what had happened in that utility room. They filled in the blanks with their own assumptions, and those assumptions ranged from the accurate to the wildly creative. Some thought she'd been assaulted and the boss had intervened. Others thought she was sleeping with Carmine, that the whole thing had been a setup to get rid of Danilo. A few, the ones with the most active imaginations, thought she was an undercover cop or a rival family's plant. All of it was whispered. None of it was said to her face. The isolation was suffocating, but it was better than the alternative. Better than being cornered in back corridors by men who thought her fear was entertainment. She moved her cloth in slow, careful circles, working the polish into the marble, keeping her head down and her movements efficient. Invisible through industriousness. That was the goal. If she looked busy enough, maybe people would stop staring. You missed a spot. Morgana's hand froze mid-circle. She knew that voice now. Deep, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to command attention. She looked up slowly, already knowing what she'd see. Carmine Rizzo stood at the top of the staircase, one hand resting casually on the banister she'd just polished, his green eyes fixed on her with that same clinical intensity that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. He was in another perfectly tailored suit, this one charcoal gray with a white shirt and no tie, the top 2 buttons undone. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, made his tattoos visible where his sleeves were rolled to his elbows. Sir. She stood up straighter, clutching her polishing cloth like a shield. I'll fix it right away. Relax, Morgana. I was joking. His expression didn't change. How are you settling into your new assignment? Fine, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. The words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. This wasn't an opportunity. This was a cage with better lighting. Carmine descended 3 steps, closing the distance between them, and Morgana had to fight every instinct that told her to back away. He stopped just outside what most people would consider personal space, his eyes moving over her face with that same assessing quality he'd had in the utility room. The bruising is healing well, he observed. No permanent damage. No, sir. Good. He was still looking at her, not blinking, not moving, just watching in a way that made her skin crawl. Not because it was predatory, exactly, though there was something possessive about it, but because it was so focused, so intense, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered in this moment. "Is there something you need, sir?" she asked when the silence stretched too long. "Just checking on my investment." He said it so casually, like she was a piece of furniture he'd had refurbished. "You understand that things have changed for you. The other staff will treat you differently. Some will resent you. Others will try to use you to get closer to me. You need to be smart about who you trust." "I don't trust anyone, sir." Something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "Good. Keep it that way." He turned and continued down the stairs, passing within inches of her. That cologne again, sandalwood and leather, expensive enough that it probably didn't have a name. Then he was past her, moving toward the main entrance where his driver waited, and Morgana could finally breathe again. This happened every day, sometimes twice a day. Carmine would appear wherever she was working, would observe her for a few minutes, would make some brief comment, and then disappear. Never threatening, never inappropriate, just present. A constant reminder that she was being watched, that her safety came with a price, and that price was his attention. The other staff had noticed. Of course they had. They saw the way the boss's eyes tracked Morgana when she moved through the main hall, the way he always seemed to know where she was. The whispers had evolved. Now, they weren't just speculating about what had happened. They were speculating about what was happening. About what would happen. Morgana tried not to think about it. She focused on her work, on the routines that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. She thought about Sophia, about the money accumulating in the envelope under her mattress, about the 8 months that had somehow shrunk to 7 months and 3 weeks. She could survive this. She'd survived worse. But then, on the evening of that 5th day, as she was walking toward the staff exit to end her shift, she felt it. That prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the one that said something was wrong, that danger was close. She slowed her pace, her hand tightening on the bag that held her few personal belongings. The corridor leading to the staff exit was dimly lit, the overhead bulbs spaced too far apart, creating pools of shadow between islands of light. It was usually empty at this hour, most of the day's staff having left already, the evening shift occupied in other parts of the estate. But tonight, it wasn't empty. 3 figures stood near the exit door, their silhouettes backlit by the security light above it. 2 of them she didn't recognize, just shapes in the darkness. But the third, the one standing slightly forward of the others, she knew immediately. Not by face, she couldn't see faces from this distance, but by posture, by the aggressive way he held himself, chest out, shoulders back, like he owned the space and everything in it. Danilo's cousin. She'd seen him around the estate, had heard him called Nico, a lower-level soldier, someone who ran errands and acted tough and dreamed of being more important than he was. Someone who had a reason to hate her. Morgana's feet stopped moving. Her mind raced through options. Turn back. Find another exit. Except there wasn't another exit from this section of the estate, not one that didn't require walking through the main house, and she couldn't do that. Staff weren't supposed to use the main entrances unless specifically instructed. She could go back to the staff quarters, wait them out. But waiting meant showing fear, and showing fear meant giving them power. And something in her, some stubborn core that had survived everything else life had thrown at her, refused to give them that satisfaction. Besides, she wasn't afraid of the ambush. Not exactly. She was afraid for them. Because if they touched her, if they tried to finish what Danilo had started, Carmine Rizzo would find out. And what had happened to Danilo would look like mercy compared to what would happen to them. The realization settled over her like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. She was protected, but that protection came with implications she hadn't fully processed until this moment. She wasn't Morgana Piazza anymore. Not really. She was Carmine Rizzo's responsibility, his property, his investment, and men didn't take kindly to other men damaging their property. She started walking again, her pace steady, her chin up. She kept her eyes on the 3 figures, watching them watch her approach. They hadn't moved yet, were just standing there, blocking the exit, waiting to see what she'd do. The corridor felt longer than it had any right to be, each step an eternity. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands stayed steady. She thought about Sophia. She thought about 7 months and 3 weeks. She thought about survival. And she thought about the cold certainty in Carmine's eyes when he'd said that things had changed, that she was under his protection, that people needed to understand what that meant. She was 20 feet away when Nico stepped forward into a pool of light. His face was harder than Danilo's, more angular, with the kind of scar tissue around his eyes that suggested he'd been in more than his share of fights. His arms were crossed, and the 2 men behind him shifted, moving to flank the doorway more completely. Long day, princess? Nico's voice carried an edge of mockery. Heard you got yourself a promotion. Main house. Boss's protection. Must be nice. Morgana stopped 10 feet away, just out of reach. I'm just trying to go home. Home, Nico repeated, like the word was funny. This isn't your home, sweetheart. This is Rizzo territory. And you got my cousin sent to the warehouse district with a busted shoulder. That's a problem for me. Your cousin assaulted me. Your cousin, Nico said, his voice hardening, was teaching you respect. And you went crying to the boss like a little bitch. The 2 men behind him laughed, low and mean. Morgana's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. I didn't go to anyone. He walked in. That's not my fault. Everything that happened to Danilo is your fault, Nico snarled, taking another step forward. You think you're special now? You think because the boss has his eye on you, that means you're untouchable? I think, Morgana said carefully, that you should let me pass. Or what? Nico's smile was all teeth and no humor. You gonna run, crying to daddy again? See, that's the thing about protection, princess. It only works when someone's watching. And right now, there's nobody here but us. The 2 men moved forward, flanking Nico, forming a wall between Morgana and the exit. They were both larger than Nico, one of them thick-necked with arms like tree trunks, the other lean but wiry with a kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd enjoy what came next. Morgana's mind calculated distances, exits, possibilities. She could scream, but would anyone come? She could run, but they were between her and the only door. She could fight, but 3 against 1 were odds that ended only one way. Her hand moved to the small canister of pepper spray in her bag, the one thing she'd brought with her from her old life. It wasn't much, but it was something. Last chance, she said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. Move, or I'm going through you. Nico laughed, a harsh bark that echoed off the concrete walls. I'd like to see you try. He lunged forward, his hand reaching for her arm, and Morgana's fingers closed around the pepper spray. She was pulling it free, thumbs searching for the trigger, when the overhead lights suddenly blazed brighter, the ones that had been dim flickering to full intensity. And the shadows moved. They didn't just move. They resolved into shapes, into men, into 4 massive figures in dark suits who emerged from alcoves and doorways that Morgana hadn't even noticed were there. Bodyguards. Professional, silent, the kind of men who were paid to hurt people efficiently and without hesitation. Nico froze, his hand inches from Morgana's arm. His face went from flushed with aggression to pale with realization in the space of a heartbeat. The 2 men behind him took an instinctive step backward, their tough guy postures crumbling like wet paper. And then Carmine Rizzo stepped out of the deepest shadow near the exit door, materializing like he'd been conjured from the darkness itself. He was in the same charcoal suit from earlier, but he'd added a black overcoat that made him look even larger, even more imposing. His hands were in his pockets, his posture relaxed, but his green eyes were absolutely glacial. Gentlemen, he said softly, and the word carried more menace than any shout could have. I believe you were about to make a very serious mistake. Nico's hand dropped to his side. His mouth opened, then closed. The 2 men behind him looked like they wanted to sink through the floor and disappear. Boss, Nico managed, his voice cracking. We were having conversation. That's all. A conversation. Carmine's tone was meditative, like he was genuinely considering the word. Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I was standing, it looked like 3 men cornering 1 woman in an isolated corridor. It looked like intimidation, possibly assault, definitely a violation of the very clear directive I issued 4 days ago. He took a step forward, and Nico took 2 steps back, bumping into his companions. The 4 bodyguards moved in tighter, forming a loose semicircle that cut off any escape route. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. Their size and silence were threat enough. "Boss, I swear, we weren't going to touch her," Nico said desperately. "We just want to talk to make sure she understood." "Understood what?" Carmine interrupted. "That you and your friends think my orders are negotiable? That you believe you can challenge my decisions as long as no one's watching? That you're stupid enough to threaten someone under my protection in my own house?" The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop. Morgana pressed herself against the wall, clutching her bag, her pepper spray still in her hand, but useless now. She was watching a performance, a carefully choreographed demonstration of power, and she understood with sudden, crystal clarity that this had never been about her safety. This had been a trap. Carmine had known. He'd probably known for days that Nico was planning something, had let it play out just far enough to make his point. "We weren't challenging you, boss," one of the other men said, his voice shaking. "We just, Danilo's family. You thought wrong." Carmine's voice hardened into something that could cut diamond. "You thought that family loyalty mattered more than my authority. You thought that because Danilo is your cousin, his mistakes should be overlooked. You thought that you could take revenge on my property without consequences." He was directly in front of Nico now, close enough that Nico had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. The bodyguards had moved in even tighter, their presence suffocating. "Let me clarify something," Carmine said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Morgana Piazza works for me. She is under my protection. That makes her mine, my responsibility, my investment, my property. Do you understand what that means?" Nico nodded jerkily, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold air. "It means," Carmine continued, each word precise and deliberate, "that anyone who touches her is touching something that belongs to me. Anyone who threatens her is threatening my authority. Anyone who harms her is declaring war on me personally. And wars, gentlemen, tend to end very badly for the side that starts them." One of the bodyguards moved, lightning fast, and suddenly the thick-necked man was on the ground, his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that made Morgana wince. He hadn't even had time to cry out. The other man, the wiry one, raised his hands in surrender, his eyes wide with terror. "Please, boss," he gasped. "We're sorry. It won't happen again. We'll leave her alone. I swear." Carmine didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on Nico, who seemed to have stopped breathing entirely. "Your cousin made a mistake," Carmine said. "He forgot his place. He forgot that everything he had was mine to give and mine to take away. I gave him mercy because he'd been loyal for 6 years, because he'd been useful, because I believed he could learn from his mistake. But you, Nico, you've been with this family for what, 8 months? You've done nothing to earn my mercy. You've done nothing but prove that you're a liability. Boss, please." Nico's voice was barely a whisper. Carmine leaned in closer, his voice dropping so low that Morgana had to strain to hear it. "She is mine. Say it. She's yours, boss. Touch her and what happens?" Nico's voice broke. "I vanish." "Completely," Carmine added. "Not fired. Not reassigned. Vanish. As in, your mother will spend the rest of her life wondering what happened to you. As in, the police will find nothing because there will be nothing to find. As in, you become a cautionary tale that gets whispered about but never confirmed. Do we have an understanding?" "Yes, boss. Complete understanding." Carmine straightened, took a step back. He looked at the man on the ground, the one with his arm twisted, and nodded once. The bodyguard released him immediately, and the man scrambled backward, clutching his shoulder. "All 3 of you are done on the estate," Carmine said, his tone shifting back to something almost conversational. "You'll work the docks. Night shift. Loading cargo. If you're lucky, if you work hard and keep your mouth shut for the next year, I might consider letting you back. If you're not lucky, if I hear even a whisper that you've been talking about tonight, about Morgana, about anything that happens in this house, you'll learn exactly what vanish means. Are we clear?" Yes, boss, they chorused, voices overlapping in their desperation to agree. Then get out of my sight. They ran, stumbling over each other in their haste to get through the exit door and into the night. The door slammed behind them, the sound echoing down the corridor, and then there was silence. The bodyguards melted back into the shadows they'd emerged from, disappearing as silently as they'd arrived. Morgana realized she was holding her breath, her knuckles white around the pepper spray that she'd never had a chance to use. Carmine turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Are you hurt?" "No." Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. You knew they were going to be here."
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.